Hello, welcome to On Wildlife. I'm your host, Alex Ray. On this podcast, we bring the wild to you. We take you on a journey into the life of a different animal every month, and I guarantee you're going to come out of here knowing more about your favorite animal than you did before. This episode is very special because it's our 150th episode. And before we go any further, I want to thank every person who has supported the show. If you've listened to one episode, all 150, or somewhere in between, thank you from all of us here at On Wildlife. Your support means the world to us, and I hope this podcast has helped you learn something new about the animals that we share this earth with. And we love getting fan mail from you guys, so I want everyone listening to this podcast to email us your favorite On Wildlife episode. Our email is onwildlife.podcast@gmail.com. Now, this episode is special for another reason, too, because we have our first ever returning guest. If you've been with us for a while, you may remember David Mizejewski, who I had the pleasure of talking to 4 years ago during National Wildlife Week. Well, he's finally back to talk to us about one of the most important groups of animals on the planet. So try not to sneeze, because we're talking about pollinators. David is a naturalist and TV host for the National Wildlife Federation. He's been on countless talk shows like The Today Show, Good Morning America, Conan, and more to spread awareness about all different types of animals. And he has lots to share with us about pollinators. But before we start the interview, I want you to think about some animals that can be classified as pollinators. Now keep that in your head and pay close attention to see how many animals we talk about that you thought of. Okay, now without further ado, let's get to the interview to talk about pollinators. Hey David, how you doing?
Hey Alex, it's great to be back.
Great to have you back. It's been about 4 years since we last had you on the show when you were talking about National Wildlife Week, which is crazy.
Yeah, time really does fly, and it does not go any slower the older you get. So,
Agreed. And it's our 150th episode, so I'm really glad you're able to join me again. So can you tell me what you've been up to since the last time we talked?
oh gosh, all sorts of stuff. The biggest thing that I can share is a project that I did with The Great Courses. If you're not familiar, it's a partner that does educational content, but it's really kind of entertaining too. It's a streaming platform and it's an app, and they basically team up with experts to do educational series. So I last year premiered a series, a 12-episode series called Field Guide to North American Wildlife, where it's basically each episode is a 30-minute deep dive into some of the coolest wildlife species that we have here in North America, mostly in the US, that I get to geek out over for an entire 30 minutes. So if you're into that kind of thing, you can definitely check it out. It's thegreatcourses.com/NWF for National Wildlife Federation. And there's a little bit of a discount that National Wildlife Federation folks can get. You can either download the videos or you could actually buy it on DVD. You can also subscribe to the platform, and then you can get access to all of their content that way too. And it's not really super announced yet, but we're going to be doing another project with The Great Courses that I won't be able to give details on yet, but stay tuned and I'll have more to share on that soon.
Oh, that sounds so awesome. That kind of reminds me of like the masterclass things.
That's exactly what it's like. It's very similar to that. And it's great. I mean, I've done lots of television, over the course of my career. I hosted a series on Animal Planet, which is actually celebrating its 20th anniversary all the way back in 2005. Backyard Habitat on Animal Planet premiered. And so I can't believe it's been that long. So, but doing the Great Courses project was great because it's a little bit more of a deep dive than you could typically do on sort of a regular television series. So If you're really into learning cool facts about wildlife, seeing some incredible footage, we've even got a little bit of storytelling in the Field Guide to North American Wildlife from the Great Courses. So I hope that folks do check it out. But that's one of the things that I've been working on in the last 4 years. I could go on and on and on about everything else, but that's not what we're here for.
I mean, it's been a while, so I'm sure you've done a million things by then. And you were talking about backyard habitats. I feel like it's a great segue into what we're talking about today, which is National Pollinator Week, June 23rd to June 29th. Can you tell us about the different types of pollinators that are out there?
Yes, absolutely. I love pollinators. They're some of the coolest wildlife that we have on this planet. And by coolest, I mean the most critically important. So, not everybody really necessarily knows what a pollinator is. So I always start by just telling folks what pollinators are. They are a diverse group of wildlife that feed on the nectar and or pollen of flowers. And when they go to get those food resources, their bodies get dusted in that pollen. And when they move on to the next plant or the next flower, some of that pollen sticks to the second flower and fertilizes it. And so basically, pollinators are how the vast majority of flowering plant species, which make up the majority of plants on this planet, are able to reproduce. And so when those flowers are fertilized, the plant is able to form seeds, which it oftentimes, encapsulates in these tasty little treats in the form of nuts and berries and just seeds. Think of like a sunflower seed, right? That is actually food for another whole host of wildlife species, including us, right? And so without pollinators, the base of the food web, which is plants, would not be able to reproduce. And all of those food sources that feed wildlife up and down that food web, again, including human beings, would not exist. And so without our pollinators, really life on this planet as we know it would cease if they all just disappear tomorrow. So as a sort of a diverse collection of wildlife, pollinators are probably, the most important group for, again, life on this planet as we know it today. And sadly, they're disappearing pretty rapidly. And that's why there's a need for things like National Pollinator Week, or, at the National Wildlife Federation, we actually celebrate pollinators the entire month of June. We just think of it as Pollinator Month. But yeah, so they're really important. And so you're probably wondering, okay, so you're talking about all these, diverse animals, what are the actual pollinators? So they're interestingly not what you would necessarily think. So let me ask you a question. What do you think, what when I say pollinator, what springs to your mind?
First thing that comes to my mind is bees, maybe butterflies.
Yeah, those are the big two that most people think about. So let me go through the list though. So yeah, bees deservedly are the kind of pollinator that has gotten the most attention. So real quick about bees. Most people think of the honeybee when you say bee, and honeybees are great, and they're really actually important for our agriculture systems here in the US. But what a lot of people don't realize is that they're not wildlife. Bees are actually a domesticated species, honeybees. And again, while they are important for agriculture, they're really important pollinators of crops, for example. Of course, they make honey. They also make beeswax, right? So there's a lot of good that they give us. But they were brought over by European colonists to North America, specifically for those services that they provide to us. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that, honeybees are really the equivalent, say of like a cow or a chicken versus wildlife, like say a bison or a sage grouse, right? Like those are the wildlife versions of those animals. It's the same thing with honeybees. And so as a result of all the attention that honeybees get, people don't know about our incredible wild native bees. So globally, there's about 20,000 species of bees on this planet. And here in North America, we've got a little bit under 4,000 species. So any given state in the US has at least a few hundred, if not a few thousand, of these wild native bee species. And they're the bee species that are pollinating all the plants in nature, right? So it's not the honeybees. It's our wild bumblebees, for example, or our sweat bees, or our digger bees, or our mason bees. And as you can tell, as I'm rattling off all these different kinds of bees, there's, again, a tremendous diversity. And the really neat thing about them that a lot of people are shocked to find out is that the vast majority of our native bees are nothing like honeybees. They don't live in hives. They don't have queens. They don't make honey. They generally don't sting, even though all the females can. Many of them do not have that black and yellow striping that we see in we think of as an iconic bee, right? So the honeybee is actually the exception to the rule in terms of what it means to be a bee in the bee world. And again, that's why it's kind of like, oh gosh, everybody just thinks of the honeybee and they're missing the real cool stuff, right? And so, yeah, most of those native bees I mentioned don't live in hives and they don't have queens. They're solitary. So it's an individual female bee. She emerges, she mates, she lays her eggs in a little tunnel, either in the ground or in like a hollow plant stem or something like that. She puts a little ball of nectar and pollen in there. She lays an egg on it. She builds a chamber wall and she fills up that little tunnel, and then she's done. She will fly off. She has completed her mission. She'll die. Her offspring will hatch and pupate. Sometimes they'll actually spend the next winter in that tunnel, and then in the spring they emerge to, keep the cycle going. So it's very, very, very different for most bee species than what we think of what a honeybee does. And of course, because there is such a diversity of these wild native bees, and they are so co-evolved with flowering plants, they're generally considered to be like the most important pollinators that we have. They just are effective at pollinating, again, because of their body shapes. They got these fuzzy bodies and these little structures on their legs that are actually evolved to hold on to pollen. And so they just move pollen really effectively. And again, there's a lot of them. So that's just sort of a little bit about what I could say about our wild native bees. But they are, one of the most primary pollinators. I'm going to catch my breath here, but I'm sure you have questions about bees.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to talk about with bees, and it's really interesting that we think of honeybees as really the bee when they're really the exception. That is crazy. And bee life cycles are just so interesting. And you talked a little bit about how effective they are at pollinating. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what makes them such effective pollinators?
Yeah, so I touched on two of their sort of physical characteristics that make them just super efficient pollinators. Number one, most bees have sort of fuzzy bodies. And, think about a typical wasp, which bees, by the way, evolved from. Bees are basically wasps that evolved to eat nectar instead of eating other insects. And we're going to talk a little bit more about wasps too as we continue the conversation, but we'll put a pin in that for a moment. So the bees evolve these furry bodies because it holds onto more pollen. They also have, again, special kind of structures on their legs that are called pollen baskets. And, in some species, they actually will collect the pollen and sort of rub it onto these baskets. And if you look closely at many bee species out there, go out into your garden right now, if you have any blooming plants, and look closely, and you'll see on the back legs of certain bees, you'll see these little yellow balls. That's pollen. And I guess I should stop too and explain what they're doing with that pollen. Why are bees collecting pollen? Well, it's because that's what they feed their babies. So bee babies eat pollen. It's super, it's rich in protein. It's got a little bit of fat in it. It's a really nutritious food source for the baby bees. And another shocking thing about bees that, again, I don't think a lot of people know is that there's a huge percentage of bees that we call pollen specialists. And what that means is that they can only feed their babies the pollen from a certain kinds of plants. And what that means, if those plants, which are typically the native plants, again, that the bees co-evolved with, if they're not found in the landscape, those bees cannot feed their babies, and their life cycles halt and their populations plummet. And that's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of bee species. And so anywhere, I've seen different estimates, anywhere from 25 to, in some estimates, say 60% of our wild native bees are pollen specialists. So,
wow.
It's kind of mind blowing when you think about it, about how bees and the native plants that they evolved with are really like two pieces of a puzzle. You really can't have one without the other, because if the bees didn't exist, then the plants would not be able to be pollinated and they wouldn't be able to reproduce themselves. and vice versa. If without the flowers providing that nectar and importantly pollen for the bees couldn't exist either. So it's a really beautiful example of the symbiosis that happens in nature, and kind of a warning about what happens when we humans pull away one of the pieces of the puzzle, right? And the ripple effect that can have.
Definitely. And isn't it true that a lot of the plant species that we view as like weeds are actually native plants that are really important to the ecosystems that we're currently in?
Yeah, so yes, that's true. But I also think it's a little bit dangerous to phrase it that way because native plants, many people think of them as quote unquote weeds, right? And the reality is that native plants, many species are highly ornamental. Many of them have been cultivated and are, common garden plants. Think of black-eyed Susans or purple coneflowers or, things like that. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that native plants are just weeds, right? Mm-hmm. With that said, the spirit of what you were just saying is absolutely true. The wild plants that grow in nature are critically important for wildlife. And this, by the way, is why a wildlife conservation group like the National Wildlife Federation has a garden-focused program, garden for wildlife. A lot of times people scratch their head and they're like, wait, don't we want to get rid of the wildlife in the garden? Aren't they going to eat everything? And no, in fact, if you want to have a healthy garden, and by garden, I mean just whatever you're planting for whatever purpose, right? Garden isn't just a vegetable garden, right? Your landscape wherever you're doing it. It could even be container gardens on a balcony or on a rooftop, right? Mm-hmm. If you're planting something for whatever reason, because you like pretty flowers or, you like to eat fresh produce, or because you want to help restore the natural world by making choices in whatever garden space you have, that all counts as gardening. So gardening for wildlife is when people choose to plant and restore the native plant populations, many of which are ornamental, right? And in doing so, then support the wildlife, notably pollinators. So it really is all connected. That's kind of the main thing here.
Yeah, that's great. And can we talk about some of the pollinators that you wouldn't really expect to be pollinators?
Yeah, so I already mentioned one, wasps.
Yeah.
Wasps are probably right up there with snakes as some of the most sort of hated wildlife. But the reality is that the vast majority of the many tens of thousands of wasp species that exist are pretty much completely harmless to people. Just like with bees, the majority of wasps are solitary. And the reason that is important, this applies to the bees as well as the wasps, is that why do bees and wasps sting? They don't sting because, you look like something that they want to go after. They're terrified of us. We're huge, right? There's nothing that they can do, well, I mean, I guess if you're allergic, there's something that they can do to give you significant harm. But the point is that bees and wasps sting defensively. Mm-hmm. They're never going to go out of their way to try to sting you. They do it when they feel threatened, right? And the social species that do form hives, they've got a lot of resources in those hives. In the case of honeybees, they've got honey and all of their brood, all of their babies are in there. Same thing with the wasps. They don't have honey, but they have all their babies. So of course, if something lumbers by and is perceived as a potential threat, they're going to try to sting you. So yeah, yellow jackets. I admit they're kind of the worst. They're kind of wasp. They do tend to be kind of aggressive, but even yellow jackets aren't going to bother you if you don't mess with them. And so that's just sort of a good reminder of like, leave them be and they'll be fine. But again, the majority of wasp species are solitary. They are not protecting their babies, right? They don't have a hive that they're being defensive of. So unless you actually pick them up in your hand and try to squish them, they're not going to sting you, right? So the reason we're talking about wasps is that wasps, like bees, are pollinators. So many species are visiting those same flowers and they're drinking up the flower nectar and maybe eating some of the pollen. But in addition to being pollinators, wasps are also predatory. So many species of wasps either feed, in addition to pollen and nectar, will feed on other insects, many of which are pests, but many of them are also parasitic. So what they'll do is they have all these specializations. So there are certain wasp species that utilize different groups of prey, basically, as essentially a host for their parasitic larvae. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, there's wasp species like tarantula hawks who target tarantulas and other spiders, right? There are species that only go after grasshoppers and crickets. Many wasp species specialize in caterpillars. And so again, a lot of these are, potential pest species. So wasps are not only doing that pollination service, but they're actually doing a huge service to us, both as home gardeners, but also for agriculture in keeping the populations of potential pests like certain moth species and, that kind of thing and grasshoppers too, and crickets and things like that. They can be agricultural pests as well. So they're doing like incredible service to us, yet we hate them. And we've been taught the first thing to do when you see a wasp is grab the pesticide and spray it. And it's just such a sad and unfortunate thing because we need those wasps. And they're way more beneficial than they are harmful.
Definitely. We did an episode on wasps a while back, and they're just the most interesting insects. I remember reading an article that they're able to identify their specific hole that they live in by the surrounding objects that are there. So if the objects were moved away from their hole, they would be looking for the hole around the object, which is just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the same is true for solitary bees. They have to, they recognize landmarks, and they, just like we would do when we go into a place that we're familiar with, where things are because your brain kind of maps it all out. And yeah, they're pretty incredible animals.
Definitely. And are there any other pollinators that we wouldn't expect?
Oh, yeah, we're just getting started. I've got several more to get through. So the other one that you mentioned were butterflies. And, butterflies are also pretty obvious. It's pretty well known that they're pollinators. They're flying around, drinking flower nectar, and again, getting brushed with the pollen and moving it around. They're not necessarily as effective pollinators as, say, the bees are, but they're still really important ones. And interestingly, though, not all butterfly species are only feeding on flower nectar. And I love to share this little factoid. Many butterfly species, either in addition to or instead of drinking flower nectar, feed on such delicious things as rotting fruit, animal dung, or even like liquefying corpses of dead animals. And it tends to be the butterfly species that are maybe living in more woodland scenarios where there's not as much sun, down on the forest floor. And therefore, there's not as many blooming plants as there would be, say, in a grassy meadow or a prairie, or something like that. And so these butterflies have evolved to drink up liquids from other sources. And so, like people think, oh, butterflies, they're so pretty and cute, but in there it's eating animal poop, So, but the butterflies they're a big class of pollinators. And of course, butterflies go hand in hand with moths. Now, moths don't get the love that their butterfly descendants do. So just like wasps came first and then bees evolved from them, same thing with butterflies and moths. The moths actually came first, and then butterflies evolved from moths, basically to take advantage of all of the blooming plants that evolved with the bees. So the bees and the blooming plants evolved together and drove each other's evolution. And the moths over there were like, hey, there's all this extra blooming stuff happening during the daytime. Why don't a branch of us evolve into being day flying and evolve our bodies to take advantage of all these new blooming plants that weren't here before? So it's really fascinating stuff. But moths are actually, I would say, more important as pollinators than butterflies are. And it's really a case of the numbers. So again, there's, moths or butterflies evolved from moths, but there's exponentially more moth species as a result, existing on the planet than there are butterflies. So it's literally a numbers thing. There's just more of them out there flying around. And yes, they do tend to, focus on night blooming plants, but not a lot of flowers don't close up at night. So moths are taking advantage of those. And the other reason that moths in particular are really important for the ecosystem is not so much their direct pollination service, but because, again, there's a lot of different moth species, and butterflies and moths, they all start out as caterpillars. And so those caterpillars are a absolute critical food source for so many other species up and down the food chain. I already mentioned wasps. Many wasp species rely on those caterpillars as food for their young so that they can keep their populations going, right? But the one that I think blows people's minds the most is that 96% of our backyard birds rely on a diet of insects and other invertebrates to feed their babies. 96%. So that's almost every kind of the scientific, way of breaking down is upland terrestrial birds. So we're not talking about, waterfowl or wading birds. It's basically all of the songbirds, all of the woodpeckers, all of the hummingbirds, right? Mm-hmm. They are feeding their babies insects. And in the case of most songbirds, it's largely the caterpillars of moths.
Wow.
So if we don't have those moths out there, which again, they're sort of not as beloved as the butterflies, but their caterpillars are an essential food source for a huge portion, a huge percentage of our backyard birds that we all want to see more of. So, when you plant a pollinator garden and you're supporting the moths, you're also supporting the birds. It's again, the message that everything is connected is there. So we've talked about bees, we've talked about wasps, we've talked about butterflies, we've talked about moths. There are many beetle and bug species that are pollinators. And a little breaking down of that terminology there. All insects are not bugs. Bugs are actually an entire specific order of insects defined by their body shapes and their behavior. Yeah, they look kind of similar in many cases to beetles, which are yet another whole order of insects. They tend to have sort of hard shells and wing cases. Most bugs have sort of sucking mouth parts. So they're typically feeding on plants and sucking in juices. Some of them use that sort of straw-like sucking mouth part as like a hypodermic needle and suck the juices out of other things, living things or animals, I guess, other insects. But there's whole groups of both bugs and beetles who have evolved to, again, feed on flower, nectar, and pollen. So they're running around the blooming plants, getting dusted in pollen and serving as pollinators. But the group of insects that I think I love sort of shocking people with that are pollinators are flies.
Wow.
Right. So what do you think of when you think of a fly, right? You think of those, green flies that are, again, flying around the dog poop and the trash cans and everything like that, right? Well, just like with all these other groups of insects, there is tremendous diversity of species. So yeah, sure, there are some flies that, they specialize on feeding on gross stuff, but there's a whole group of flies that are called flower flies or syrphid flies. And these oftentimes are actually mimics of bees and wasps. They tend to have that yellow and black and striping that a lot of those bees and wasps, but not all, that they have. And of course, they're totally harmless. They can't sting. But again, that's like sort of coevolution where, one group of wildlife mimics another to gain some benefit from that mimicry, right? And so, but the syrphid flies are probably, after the bees, some of the most important pollinators in terms of their effectiveness, again, due to their numbers. And so they're flying around, drinking flower nectar and pollinating. But the really neat thing about them is that not only are they providing that pollination service, like with the wasps, they're pollinating, but then they're also hunting. It's kind of the same with the syrphid flies, except it's not the adult flies, it's their larvae. So those little fly larvae are voracious predators of small, soft-bodied insects like aphids. So if anybody out there is a gardener, aphids are these little tiny green insects, and they, they're sap suckers, right? So they can really kind of get out of control and kind of start sucking the life out of some of your plants. And so you want the syrphid flies because not only are they going to be pollinating your flowers, but they're also going to be, their larvae are going to be helping to take care of some of those aphids. So again, it's all about an ecosystem. But there's one group of flies that is going to be a tough sell. But I have to tell people, because it's my job as a naturalist to just sort of interpret the natural world and let people know, the reality of things. And so mosquitoes are pollinators.
That's disappointing for a lot of people, I think.
Well, here's the good news. Mosquitoes, of course, they're a kind of fly, right? So that's why I'm including them under flies. Not everybody, realizes that, but they're a part of the fly order. And so, yeah, what happens is that because for obvious reasons, we think of mosquitoes as being bloodsuckers. because we are on their menu. But the reality is that the main food source for mosquitoes is not blood. It's flower nectar. And in fact, it's only the female mosquitoes that even ever try to get a blood meal and try to bite us. The males, they're out there just drinking flower nectar, happily pollinating things. And the females only seek the blood meal when they're getting ready to lay eggs because they need that extra sort of protein and other nutrients. And so it's really just the females and only when they're reproducing. But the good news is that there are no plants that are like sort of completely tied to mosquitoes as their only pollinator. And in fact, as far as pollinators go, mosquitoes are way, way, way down on the list of importance. They're kind of generalist. They kind of pollinate things, but it's not like a super effective pollination like the bees or the syrphid flies. So you don't have to worry about wanting to avoid mosquitoes or eliminate their habitat. That's actually a good thing to do. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I will say we've got a whole bunch. We actually have a whole blog series about it on what mosquitoes are, what roles they play, and the best ways to eliminate the chances of being bitten by a mosquito that don't rely on just nuking the entire landscape with pesticides, which, spoiler, is a really terrible thing to do. Please don't do that because you will. I don't care what the marketing claims are from the pest control companies. If you're spraying for mosquitoes, you're killing the butterflies, you're killing the bees, you're killing those syrphid flies, you're killing all of these incredibly important pollinating insects. So don't do that. But anyway, mosquitoes are pollinators, but it's okay if you want to squish them or put repellent on or get rid of their breeding habitat.
Absolutely. And we have, preconceived notions of every single animal, but every animal has its purpose in its specific ecosystem, native habitat.
Exactly, yeah. So there's a couple more pollinators to cover that we have here in North America. So all of the ones that I just told you about, the bees, the wasps, the butterflies, the moths, the beetles, the bugs, the flies, those are all obviously insects. But there are some vertebrate wildlife that are pollinators that we have in North America. And I've mentioned one group of them a couple times already, and that's hummingbirds. So hummingbirds only found in North and South America, incredible little birds that have just, such a fascinating evolutionary history where they can flap their wings at incredible speeds. They can hover, they can fly backwards, and they have these super long bills that inside of which is this tongue that has a little feathery tip. And that whole structure that they have, again, is like two pieces of a puzzle. It is designed specifically to go into deep tubular shaped flowers. So they're like, again, they just fit like perfectly together, right? And so the tongue comes out and the little feathery tip just kind of, like flickers in and out inside the flower, and it kind of pulls in all of the flower nectar that's down at the bottom of that flower. And the flowers, I should mention this. We haven't actually talked about flowers, so let me just take one little side step to talk about them, and then we'll come back to hummingbirds. The plants essentially have figured out how to take absolute advantage of these dumb animals that are running around and utilize these moving busybody animals to do the work of mating, essentially, right? Pollination, it put another way, is just plant sex. Right? Plants can't move to each other, right? So they figured out ways of baiting these dumb animals. Oh, come get a nice little sip of nectar. It's high calorie. It's what you need to flap your wings. But then the plants have evolved to grow structures that then when that hummingbird comes in, its anthers, the part of the flower that produces the pollen, which is the male reproductive parts in the whole plant sex thing, right? The anthers stick in such a spot that when the hummingbird comes in, it will hit the hummingbird on the forehead or on the chest so that all of the pollen gets on it. And again, plants that are specialized with their pollinators have these kinds of structures. So plants that are pollinated by bees are set up in such a way that they deliver the pollen to the body of bees. Plants that are pollinated by other things, like the hummingbirds, have different structures. So, and again, remember I was talking about the sort of coevolution and diversification. That's what I'm talking about, right? We have so many different kinds of blooming plants, which is great for us as gardeners because we love seeing all the pretty flowers and all the different shapes and colors. that led to this great diversity of wildlife and vice versa, right? It's just so fascinating. But anyway, the hummingbirds come in, they drink the flower nectar, they get rubbed with pollen, they go on, and the same story as with the other one. So they're really neat. But I will say this, I said this earlier too, is that hummingbirds do not survive on a diet of flower nectar alone, which is something that most people think. They rely on insects, notably the little itty bitty insects that are quite honestly some of the most annoying. Little gnats and little tiny flies, that no-see-ums and all of those things that buzz around your head, including mosquitoes. Those are the scale of the insect that the size-wise that the hummingbirds are feeding, because they themselves are so tiny. Mm-hmm. So, attract a hummingbird, kill a mosquito, right? It's how it works. The other group of pollinators, vertebrate pollinators that we have in North America are bats. So we've got 47 species of bats in North America, and all but 3 of them they feed on insects, and so as their primary food source. But there's 3 species of bats, mostly that are found sort of south of the U.S. So they're found in Mexico and into Central America, that will migrate up into Southern California or other desert Southwest states. So it's the Mexican long-tongued, the lesser long-nosed, and I'm completely drawing a blank on what the third one is, but at any rate, these are nectar and fruit-eating bats. So in those arid landscapes, you've got a lot of cactus and succulents and that kind of thing. And so they're blooming plants too. So they will put out these, in many cases, gorgeous blooms that are shaped exactly to fit the muzzles of these devore bats, right? So again, 2 pieces of the puzzle. And they get dusted with the pollen, and just like all the rest of them, they then move it on. And bats are really neat because they're pollinating things like bananas. They're pollinating things like agave, which if you like a margarita or that tequila shot, the agave is the plant that we use to make tequila, right? So like, thank a bat, when you're out sitting and having your margarita, right? So they're really cool, and they're really important. And so, yeah, those are the categories of wildlife that here in North America are pollinators. Those insects, it's the hummingbirds, it's the bat species. Globally, there are all sorts of other animals that also get into the pollination game. One of the coolest is there's an opossum species that lives in South America. And so, the opossums are the mammals, the marsupial mammals that are found in the Americas. We've got one of them that ranges, up into the U.S., and that is the Virginia opossum. I think everybody knows what they look like. They're kind of, the grayish white and the long tail, and everybody hates them because they're ugly looking, but they're like also the raddest animals out there. Mm-hmm. You can have me back on for another episode and we could talk about nothing but opossums.
I'd love to.
Yeah, I will be in heaven because they're one of my favorites. But yeah, the opossums, there's a species that lives in South America, and there's dozens of species, some of which look nothing like the Virginia opossum. But there is a species that recently was discovered to be basically feeding on flowers, and it was documented to be pollinating. There's also lizards that are documented as pollinators. So I think there's even lemurs that are pollinators as well in Madagascar. So these are little primates. So anyway, there's a lot of diversity in the kinds of animals that are pollinators. But like we started out with, all of them are really, really important for flowering plants to reproduce. Again, they're the majority of the plant species on the planet. Over 80% of our plants are flowering plants. So we need to have these pollinators out there doing their job. We benefit from it every single day, and not just because of the margaritas, right? A lot of our crops are the result of animal pollinators, and a lot of the foods that we feed our livestock are actually pollinated by some of these insects in particular. So, if you like a steak, if you like milk, if you like ice cream, you can thank a pollinator, because they're not doing anything directly to the cows that give us those foods, but they're pollinating the crops that we feed the cows. So it's all connected.
That's so interesting. And I'm noticing kind of a theme where a lot of the animals that we kind of push aside, we think of as pests, we have a negative connotation to, are doing so much for the ecosystems and for us. And we should be thanking them in return instead of shying away from them.
You get an A+ for hearing the message. I appreciate that, because that really is the message that I'm here to give. Put super succinctly. I mean, I've been talking for almost an hour here, and that's really the crux of it, right? You just said it right there in those sentences. And that's why this is what the work of the National Wildlife Federation is all about, And it's not just pollinators, it's our predators, and it's our marine life, and everything in between. It's all part of this incredible system of life that we have on this planet, that for good or for ill, we human beings are stewards of, or if we make poor choices, the destroyers of. And we do that at our own peril, because there's only so many strands that we can pluck from that sort of web of life before the whole thing destabilizes and it crumbles in on ourselves. So, and we're already seeing that with climate change. Climate change isn't just about saving the polar bears, right? It's about saving ourselves. So many humans are being put at risk and in danger because of the effects of the climate change that we have caused. Wildfires, floods, extreme weather events are all exactly the kinds of results of the destabilization of our climate from the global climate change. But again, that's a whole other topic that we can get into at another time.
Definitely. It's not a coincidence that you're seeing more and more of these natural disasters that are starting to happen.
No, it's actually so obvious, and it's exactly the kinds of results that have been predicted since we've been, monitoring the human-caused climate change, from burning fossil fuels and cutting down our forests and so on. So yeah, it's just really not a surprise at all.
Definitely. And I'm interested to know why we view butterflies in a positive light, but we don't view moths in that light. Is it just because they're out at night? It doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah, I think it has to do with colorfulness.
Maybe, yeah.
So many butterfly species, but not all, do have these sort of flashy, beautiful colors. And yes, they are also generally active during the daylight hours when we humans are. So we just have more exposure to them. And it is true that many moth species are nondescript. They're shades of browns or gray, and they don't stand out as much. And, we're not hanging out in the middle of the night, usually outside in our garden spaces, so we're not seeing them. Mm-hmm. But I encourage everybody to just do a little Googling about moths. There are some awesome species. Some of our giant moths, like the Cecropia moth, or the Io moth, or the Polyphemus moth, or the Luna moth, they're huge, beautiful moths. The Luna moth in particular has just such a beautiful, like a seafoam green color. There are moths that look nothing like what you would think a moth would look like. Some of them look like wasps. Some of them do fly during the day. So they're actually called hummingbird moths, because they have these fat, furry bodies and short wings, and they fly during the day, and they're almost as big as a hummingbird. So the name is like completely appropriate. And, you would be easily fooled into thinking it was a hummingbird if you didn't get a close look at it. So moths themselves are just filled with diversity and forms and shapes that often, again, just go overlooked by us because we're not paying attention. And I guess that's another message that I'd love for folks to kind of think about a little bit more, is that we all can be naturalists. My title at the National Wildlife Federation is naturalist, right? But anybody can be a naturalist. Like you can't get a degree in being a naturalist. A naturalist is just somebody who loves nature and wants to be outside in it and observes and learns, and then shares it and helps other people understand it, right? That's all a naturalist is. So, Charles Darwin was a naturalist. Jane Goodall is a naturalist. Steve Irwin was a naturalist. But your third grade teacher could have been a naturalist, right? Your local nature center employee is a naturalist. Your National Park Service rangers are naturalists, right? Like anybody can be a naturalist. So don't be intimidated by that. But it really starts with just getting outside and looking around and paying attention. Put your device down for a minute. And I'm not bashing devices, because there's a lot of cool apps that can help you learn how to identify things in nature, whether they're bird calls or tracks or scat or whatever, that I didn't have when I was growing up learning all this stuff that I wish that I did, right? But, it does require you to sort of slow down a little bit, get outside, use all your senses, smell the air, listen, not just it's not just about your eyes, what you can see. You can experience all sorts of cool wildlife and natural phenomenon if you through your other senses. It's not just about what you see, but that's where it really starts. And kids in particular, are sadly not getting outside anywhere near as much as the previous generations. And we're seeing the results of that in terms of the negative health impacts of indoor children, right? That never get to go outside and explore nature. We know that kids that, get to play in nature, learn about nature, and then they grow up into adults that know why it's important to protect nature, right?
Yeah.
So that's another big thing that the National Wildlife Federation is really committed to is helping to get everybody, but kids in particular, that time outdoors that we know is so hugely beneficial to them mentally, emotionally, physically. But that's also what we know, helps people learn about why nature is important to protect.
Yeah, definitely. And could you talk about some of the things that are causing issues for pollinators?
Yeah, so pollinators, like many wildlife species, are hugely impacted by how we humans alter the landscape. And so that, at its most basic level, is habitat destruction. Habitat is the resources in nature that a species needs to survive. So for pollinators, what pollinators need are blooming plants. And they need plants that are pesticide free. So think about our typical suburban yard. It doesn't have many blooming plants. It's mostly lawn, and we douse it with pesticides. So it's no wonder that pollinators are disappearing. It's no wonder that the monarch butterfly, for example, which used to be super common, found coast to coast, is now being proposed to be listed as a threatened species and protected under the Endangered Species Act. Their populations have plummeted. It's no surprise that many of our native bees, particularly our bumblebees, so the rusty-patched bumblebee that used to be super common in the Midwest and the Northeast, is now also listed as an endangered species. But the western bumblebee is disappearing. The Franklin's bumblebee might actually already be extinct. The American bumblebee is rapidly disappearing right before our eyes. And that's just a tiny fraction of the bee species that are declining, right? So this is a bigger picture issue, right? There's agriculture implications, especially with pesticides and just sort of the sheer volume of land that industrial agriculture takes up, right? But it's particularly germane for the average person who has an opportunity to transform their own little piece of the earth, whether that is an acre suburban, backyard, or 5 acres in a rural place, or even, like I mentioned earlier, a little tiny green patch in a community garden in the middle of New York City, right? Or any other urban area, right? We can help, in particular, pollinators, because they need plants. And that's, again, what Garden for Wildlife is all about. And our Garden for Wildlife movement, our focus in June is pollinators for this reason, because you can still be getting out there and planting the native plants that these pollinators need as a source of nectar, as a source of pollen. And then, once those pollinators pollinate the plants, they're going to put out the seeds and the nuts and the berries that feed the birds and feed the squirrels and feed the deer and feed the black. It's all, again, I keep saying it, it's all connected, but I can't not say it because it's true.
It's true.
Every single case, right? So habitat loss in general is the elimination of our native plants in particular and replacing them with non-native plants that don't have these ecological relationships with the wildlife, notably the pollinators. And then replacing them, like I said, with lawn and the non-native ornamental plants instead of the ornamental native plants, right? Like we can do that. So that's a big thing that we can all do that sort of solves for that habitat destruction issue. The other big thing is the pesticide issue. So here's the thing. When we spray pesticides, we're not just killing the mosquitoes or, the carpenter ants that you think are getting into your house, but probably aren't, right? We are killing all of these beneficial insect pollinators. And it's kind of heartbreaking to me. I have seen a real uptick in people hiring companies to come out and spray these broad spectrum insecticides. So these are insecticides that will kill any kind of insect they come in contact with, all over their entire yard. And the companies are like, oh, these are bee safe. And, they might be honeybee safe at night when the honeybees are all in their hives. But as we already talked about, the majority of our native bees, for example, don't live in hives. Guess where they're hanging out? In the leaves and the vegetation. So when these companies are coming and spraying your yard to get rid of the mosquitoes, they're killing the bees, they're killing the caterpillars, they're killing the butterflies. It's the reality. So like I said, there are better ways of controlling mosquitoes and minimizing your chances of getting bitten. Simple things like put on repellent, it works. And you don't even have to use DEET. You can use some of the herbal-based ones, which are just as effective. You just have to apply them more often. You can, the number one thing is to eliminate breeding spots, because most mosquitoes don't fly far from where they emerge out of the water, where they hatched and spent their larval phase. So, think about clogged gutters. That's one of the biggest sources of mosquitoes around your house. If you have little pools of water in your gutter because there's leaves in there, but any standing body of water around your yard, just empty it. If you have a bird bath, just dump it every couple of days. It takes mosquitoes 5 to 7 days to go through that aquatic larval phase. So if there's any mosquito larvae or eggs in your bird bath, you just dump it out and they go bye-bye, right? You should be doing that anyway to keep it clean for the birds, right? So, avoiding those pesticides, sticking with tried and true organic gardening methods that people have been using for millennia before we had any of these, hand picking, barriers, encouraging planting habitat gardens with the native plants to draw in those predatory and parasitic wasps, to draw in the songbirds, to draw in the hummingbirds, to draw in the bats. They're going to help keep all of these pest insects in check so you don't have to spray toxic pesticides everywhere. There's one other kind of very insidious pesticide that is harming our pollinators, and that is a group of pesticides known as neonicotinoids. And what these are systemic pesticides. So when a plant is treated with them, it gets absorbed into the plant system and is in every part of the plant. And it's, they're so effective at that like seeds that are treated with neonicotinoids will grow into plants that will have the neonicotinoid chemical throughout it. And unfortunately, even some of our native plants that are widely cultivated by the horticulture industry are subject to getting treated with some of these neonicotinoid pesticides, which means that if you are not an informed consumer, you might go to a big box store and buy a purple coneflower that you think is going to be great for the bees, and you might inadvertently be poisoning the bees. So it's really important because the neonicotinoid pesticide is in the pollen and it's in the nectar, right? And it's in the leaves. So if it's a caterpillar host plant, they're going to eat that. And if it doesn't kill them outright, it's going to weaken them, right? And that's going to make their survival long-term. So what the way you navigate that is just be an informed consumer. Ask at your local garden center if these are treated plants with any kind of pesticide. And if the answer is yes, then take your business elsewhere. I can educate people and be an advocate for this, but if 100 people with their hard-earned dollars are walking into a garden center and saying, we want to spend our money here, but only if you're not killing our pollinators, that's powerful. That's more powerful than 10 of me doing talks like this. So I really do hope people will go out there and be consumer advocates in that way. And that's how we're going to get more organic ornamental plants, native plants in production and more widely available. So the key message with pollinators is plant native plants, don't spray pesticides, reduce your lawn, turn it into native plant beds. And it's that simple. Like, we really can save pollinators very, very easily if we all did this, even on a little small patch of our yards or other garden spaces. So it's very achievable if we all do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important to understand that one person can make an impact with their money and just with what they're consuming or what they're doing to their own lawn. And if you're not using pesticides, then you can actually create something really beautiful in your own backyard that you wouldn't be able to see unless you stopped using those harmful chemicals.
100%. And think about the incredible diversity of landscapes that we have across North America, right? It's so sad to me. I'm on the East Coast. I literally fly around the country and, give talks and, do events and media appearances. And I see the same landscapes in California that I do in Maine, that I do in Florida, like the same basic concept that I do in Arizona. And that's just like bonkers to me. We have this such rich diversity in natural history. Like, why don't we celebrate that? Why do we have to look exactly alike and be cookie cutter, right? To the detriment of all of our fellow species. So that's one of the best parts about committing to working with the native indigenous plants, because you not only are that's the number one way that you'll help the local wildlife, but it's also like so cool to celebrate that what makes where you live unique, I think. So that's what we're hoping people will do, is plant native, stop spraying pesticides, reduce your lawn. And it won't just be the pollinators that will benefit. It'll be all the other wildlife. And then you get to benefit because you get to see and observe these really cool creatures that are our fellow species that can live right alongside us totally harmoniously if we just give them a little bit of habitat. It's that simple.
I think that's a perfect note to end it on. Thank you so much again, David, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I learned more than I ever thought I knew about pollinators today. So that's just amazing.
Well, I appreciate it. And that's like the biggest compliment you could give me. So I'm going to, walk away from this feeling really good. And I hope listeners enjoy it and they learn something too. And they commit to getting out there and helping the pollinators.
Absolutely. David is such a pleasure to have on the show. And I can't thank him enough for sitting down with me and chatting about some of the most important animals on the planet. Without them, most of the things that we take for granted would be gone. So pollinators really deserve our love and respect. Now that we all learned how amazing pollinators are, we should support some organizations that are working to help their populations thrive, like the National Wildlife Federation, Pollinator.org, and the Xerces Society. I also want to thank everyone again for sticking with us through 150 episodes. You're the reason we've been able to do this for so long, and I can't wait to continue sharing animal knowledge with you. Thank you for coming on this adventure with me as we explored the world of pollinators. You can find the sources that we use for this podcast and links to organizations that we reference at onwildlife.org. You can also email us with any questions at onwildlife.podcast@gmail.com. And you can follow us on Instagram at @on_wildlife or on TikTok at @onwildlife. And don't forget to tune in next month for another awesome episode. And that's On Wildlife.
You've been listening to On Wildlife with Alex Ray. On Wildlife provides general educational information on various topics as a public service, which should not be construed as professional, financial, real estate, tax, or legal advice. These are our personal opinions only. Please refer to our full disclaimer policy on our website for full details.